After studying this module, you shall be able to understand how anxiety is produced and the different kinds of anxiety. Learn how the ego deals with anxiety and employs various defense mechanisms. Learn about the psychosexual stages of development proposed by Freud. Evaluate Freud's psychoanalytic theory. The psychoanalytic approach to personality proposed by Freud thus assumes that a dynamic interplay of inner forces often conflict with each other and shape the personality of the individual. There is a focus on the unconscious determinants of behavior. Freud believed that every human action has a cause and is purposeful. His theories regarding the levels of consciousness, the structure of personality, the ego defense mechanisms, and the psychosexual stages are very important in the discussion of personality. How the inner forces, instinctual drives, and the childhood development all have an impact on the personality of a person and its development. Anxiety. Freud gives emphasis on the interplay of tensions between various components of personality, between competing drives, tensions from sources of suffering, etc., that lead to anxiety. According to him, anxiety is a felt, affective, unpleasant state accompanied by a physical sensation that warns the person against impending danger. The unpleasantness is often vague and hard to pinpoint, but the anxiety is always felt. It is the ego which feels the anxiety, but ego's interaction with the id, superego, and external reality results in three different forms of anxiety: objective or realistic anxiety, neurotic anxiety, and moral anxiety. Objective or realistic anxiety, that is, reality versus ego. Objective anxiety is associated with the objective threats to our well-being. There is a generalized feeling of anxiety which may involve possible danger. For example, when walking alone at night in a dangerous alleyway, the anxious feelings are justified, since there is a possibility of adverse events happening. But it is different from fear, because the feeling is not regarding a specific object. Objective anxiety arises when the ego is threatened by objective forces in the world. The force is a function of strength of the ego in relation to the power or perceived power of the objective threat. Neurotic anxiety, that is, id versus ego. Neurotic anxiety arises when the ego is threatened by the irrational forces of the id. Here, the source of the anxiety is from within our personality, and hence there is no obvious escape from it. There is an apprehension about an unknown danger, which may be triggered by some elements in the environment, like occurrence of certain events or presence of certain people. The person is not able to understand why anxiety is being triggered, since it stems from the unconscious. It is one manifestation of how powerful instinctual energy threatens to overcome the ego. Moral anxiety, that is, superego versus ego. Here, it is the irrational demands of the superego that threaten to overcome the ego. And here also there is no escape, as the threat is from within the personality. Moral anxiety is experienced as guilt, overzeal, or imagined departures from internalized values. The superego acts as a dictator here, chastising the person for yielding to morally incorrect temptations. Ego defense mechanisms. As we saw, when the ego confronts the impulse of the id or the superego that threatens to go out of control, or when it is faced with dangers from the environment, it results in anxiety. Ego then tries to reduce the anxiety through realistic strategies. But when these are ineffective, it resorts to certain unconscious mental operations that deny or distort the reality. The anxiety would become intolerable if the ego cannot resort to these defensive behaviors. These behaviors serve the function of protecting the ego against the pain of the anxiety. Freud initially identified certain principal defense mechanisms, including repression, displacement, reaction formation, regression, projection, sublimation, introjections, and fixation. Later, his daughter Anna expanded his work in the area and identified further mechanisms. Repression. Repression is the most basic of all defense mechanisms. It is an active defense process in which the ego pushes away the anxiety-arousing impulses into the unconscious mind. For example, a person may develop amnesia about a childhood sexual abuse that has been repressed. Often, feelings and thoughts are so strongly repressed that they remain in the unconscious throughout the life. Repression may be complete or partial. In partial repression, the impulse may express itself in a disguised manner. The process of repression is the result of socialization. No society permits a complete and uninhibited expression of sex and aggression. When children are punished for sexual or hostile behaviors, they learn to be anxious whenever they experience these impulses. Although this anxiety rarely leads to a complete repression of their drives, it often results in partial repression. Denial. Denial is refusing to acknowledge the anxiety-arousing aspects of the environment. It may involve either the emotions associated with an event or the event itself. It is a defense mechanism employed in the face of intense anxiety, or when the person is overwhelmed by the threatening reality. It is reconstructing the meaning of the event so that the threat is gone. For example, a patient diagnosed with cancer refuses to believe that he has cancer and totally negating such a possibility. Displacement. Displacement is redirecting the repressed emotions onto an object less dangerous than the initial one which aroused the emotion. The redirection may be onto not only a single object alone, but a variety of people or objects such that the original impulse is disguised or concealed. For example, taking out your anger towards your boss onto your kids back home. It may also be displaced onto your spouse, at other drivers as you drive home, at the government policies and whatnot. Projection. Projection refers to repressing an unacceptable impulse and attributing it to others. Simply put, it is seeing in others the unacceptable feelings or tendencies that actually reside in one's own unconscious. For example, a man may consistently interpret the actions of older women towards him as attempted seductions. Consciously, the thought of having sex with older women may be intensely repugnant to him, but buried in his unconscious is a strong erotic attraction to these women. Rationalization. Rationalization is conjuring up socially acceptable but false explanations for an anxiety-arousing behavior that has already occurred. In other words, the person reduces the anxiety by finding a rational excuse for a behavior that was really done for unacceptable reasons. For example, a girl may explain that she finished an entire cake because otherwise it would have gone bad. Rationalization seems very common in people's responses to success and failures. It helps maintain one's self-esteem. If you don't get into a medical school, you may convince yourself that you really didn't want to be a doctor anyway. Reaction formation. Reaction formation involves the repression of an impulse and releasing its psychic energy in an exaggerated expression of the opposite behavior. The resulting behavior is often obsessive and compulsive in nature. For example, a mother with feelings of resentment towards her child becomes overprotective or pampers the child excessively. It is against the notions of society that a mother harbors bitterness towards her own child. It would produce too much anxiety in the mother, and hence it is repressed, and due to the intensity of the issue and the guilt felt by the mother, the reactive behavior takes the opposite pole. She expresses her fondness of the child overly to deceive herself. Her overt behavior may include spending extravagantly on the child and boast about the child to others. Regression. Regression refers to responding to the situation by retreating to a mode of behavior characteristic to earlier stages of development. This is almost always a temporary behavior, exhibited during times of anxiety or stress. When faced with such a situation, the ego invests the libido in familiar and secure patterns of behavior or objects. For example, a student asks his professor to raise his grades and when refused, throws a temper tantrum. An extreme manifestation of regression is when the person coils into a fetal position, indicating the intensity of the anxiety felt. Sublimation. Sublimation refers to repressing impulses and releasing them in a substitutive socially acceptable or even admired behavior. Sublimation is the repression of the genital aim of eros by substituting a cultural or social aim. The sublimated aim is expressed most obviously in creative cultural accomplishment such as art, music and literature, and more subtly it is part of all human relationships and all social pursuits. For example, a man with severe hostile impulses becomes an investigative reporter who ruins political careers of people. In this example, the man is able to combine sublimation and the direct expression of his hostile impulses in a balanced manner. He can pursue his impulses but do it in a socially accepted way. Intellectualization. Intellectualization is the repression of the emotion concerned with an upsetting event and dealing with the situation as an intellectually interesting event. There is a tendency to think about the threats or events in cold, analytical and detached terms, thereby helping the person to dissociate his thoughts from the feelings involved. For example, a boy, upon being dumped by his girlfriend, remarks about the unpredictability of relationships these days. Fixation. Fixation is a mechanism involved in the psychosexual development of children. According to Freud, fixation is the permanent attachment of the libido onto an earlier and more primitive stage of development. Like in regression, where the person goes back to previous levels of development, fixation is also a tendency to remain at lower levels. The difference is that fixation is more or less a permanent investment of libido. When the prospect of growing up and advancing to the next level of development is stressful and anxiety arousing, the ego may resort to remain at the present and more comfortable stage. An example would be that of a grown-up individual who has a nail-biting habit, which may be due to his or her fixation at the oral stage. Introjection or identification. Increasing feelings of worth by identifying self with another person or institution, often of illustrious standing, is called introjection. It can be said that this defense mechanism is opposite to that of projection. Here, the person adopts positive or perceived positive attributes of another person. Basically, it is an impersonation of another's ego. For example, a teenager may adopt the mannerisms and lifestyles of favorite movie stars. The psychosexual stages of development. Freud believed that adult personality traits are powerfully influenced by experiences in the first years of life. In fact, he believed that personality is largely determined by the age of 5. He proposed a series of 5 psychosexual stages, during each of which the id's pleasure-seeking tendencies are focused on different areas of the body and on activities concerned with these erogenous zones. They are called the psychosexual stages since at each stage the libido is discharged through the particular erogenous zone. Deprivation or overindulgence in each stage can lead to fixation, a state of arrested psychosexual development which turns out as personality defects in adulthood. This is reflected in a predominance of attitudes and interests that characterize the stage at which fixation has occurred. If fixation is due to deprivation, the needs of the person are unmet and the person can't advance until they are satisfied. If it is due to overindulgence, the person is much too comfortable at that particular stage that he or she is reluctant to move on. The oral stage. It extends from birth to about 18 months of age. During this time, much of the infant's interaction with the external world occurs through the mouth, and libidinal gratification is focused in this area. It is the source of tension, reduction and pleasurable sensations. The oral stage has 2 substages. The sexual aim of early oral activity is to incorporate or receive into one's body the object choice, which is the nipple. During this oral receptive phase, infants feel no ambivalence towards the pleasurable object and their needs are usually satisfied with minimum anxiety. As they grow older, however, they are far more likely to experience feelings of frustration as a result of less frequent feedings and eventual weaning. The traits that develop at this stage include a general sense of optimism, trust, and dependency on others. These relate to the fact that infants at this age are particularly helpless and dependent on their caregivers. The next part of the oral stage is the oral sadistic phase, and it begins with teething. The sexual pleasure now comes from biting and chewing. According to Carver and Scheer, the adult personality traits arising during this phase can be traced to this newly acquired ability. This phase is thought to determine who is verbally aggressive in later life and who tends to use biting sarcasm in conversation. Generally, adults who are orally fixated are likely to be preoccupied with food and drink, likely to reduce tension through activities centered around the mouth like biting nails or smoking, and when angry, engage in verbal aggression. The anal stage. This stage begins from 18 months and continues into the 3rd year. The anus is the erogenous zone and sexual pleasure is derived from the stimulation that occurs when the child defecates. In the early anal phase, as toilet training begins, children often behave aggressively towards parents for frustrating them with restraints. They are no longer allowed to relieve themselves whenever and wherever they wish, and the introduction of discipline may trigger the aggression. In the late anal stage, children often develop a friendly interest in their excreta and may present it to their parents as a valued prize. If they are chastised for this behavior, children may adopt an anal retentive habit. They may attempt to withhold feces. The anal retentive personality is characterized by rigidity and excessive orderliness. The traits of the adult anal retentive is sometimes referred to as the anal triad: stinginess, obstinacy, and orderliness. If the child is punished and ridiculed, they may react in another manner too. They may adopt a pattern of rebellion and develop anal expulsive habits, excreting forcefully when the parents least want it. The adult anal expulsive personality is characterized by stoppiness, excessive lavishness, and general disorderliness. On the other hand, if the child is appreciated for his or her effort in being disciplined, then it is likely that he or she will grow into a generous and magnanimous adult. The phallic stage. This stage lasts from 3 to 5 years of age. During this period, the erogenous zone is the genital organ. According to Freud, this is the time when most children begin to masturbate for the first time, as they become aware of the sensory pleasure that arises from genital manipulation. Just as their experiences with weaning and toilet training had implications in the development of the adult personality, the children's experiences with the suppression of masturbation also has implications. But Freud focuses more on the resolution of the Oedipus complex as the major determinant of adult personality at this stage. At the first, the sexual pleasure is totally derived from self-stimulation, but gradually the libido begins to shift towards the opposite sex parent. As boys develop an interest in their mothers and the girls develop an interest in their fathers. At the same time, the child becomes hostile towards the same-sex parent because of the perceived competition between them over the affection of the other parent. The Oedipus complex. This is the term Freud used to denote the unconscious desire of the male child to sexually possess the mother. There is a jealousy, hostility, and hatred towards the father whom the child perceives as being more loved by the mother. Sometimes the jealousy may be so extreme that he may want the father out of the family or even dead. These feelings induce strong feelings of guilt and also the fear that physically greater father will castrate him. Freud called this the castration anxiety. Boys eventually bury their impulses out of the castration anxiety, and the complex is usually resolved by identification with the father. The process of identification serves multiple purposes. Being like his father makes his father seem less likely to harm him, thereby reducing his castration anxiety. And by identifying with the desirable aspects of the father, the boy reduces his ambivalence towards him. The process of identification thus paves way for the development of the superego as the boy introjects his father's values. Thereafter, normal psychosexual development takes place. If the complex is left unresolved, the boy may become mother fixated and the abnormality like neurosis, pedophilia or homosexuality may occur in adult life. The female Oedipus complex, sometimes known as the Electra complex. This is the counterpart of the Oedipus in girl children, and according to Freud, they have a sexual desire for the father and experience what is termed as penis envy. Upon discovering their lack of penis, they abandon their love for the mother and blame her for this condition. The girl's attention is drawn to her father because he does have a penis, the symbol of power. Ultimately, she desires that she bear her father's child as a substitute for the penis. The complex is resolved when the girl gives up masturbation, surrenders her desire for the father, and identifies with her mother. But the identification helps in an indirect manner. By becoming more like her mother, she gains vicarious access to her father. And just as in irresolution of the male Oedipus, unsuccessful resolution here may result in the girl being father fixated. The latency stage. At the close of the phallic stage, the child enters a period of relative calm, termed the latency period. This period from approximately the 6th year of the life to the early teens is a time when sexual and aggressive drives become less active. The lessening of these urges results partly from the changes within the body and partly from the emergence of the ego and the superego in the child's personality. Freed from the grip of impulses, children turn their attention to other pursuits, often of an intellectual or social nature. Thus, the latency period is a time when the child's experiences broaden, and rather than a time when new conflicts are confronted and new traits produced. As an example, parental identifications adopted during the phallic stage may be supplemented by identifications with other figures of authority, perhaps religious figures or teachers. The genital stage. With the onset of puberty, the libidinal energy starts to focus again on the genitals. In early adolescence, although the personal experiences sexual desire, the release of the energy is not socially sanctioned and therefore seeks release through sex-related activities like fantasizing and masturbation. As they enter into the later adolescence, the individual will enter the final stage of psychosexual development. If all the earlier stages have been gone through successfully, the person's libido will be available to be invested in the rightful erogenous zone and will remain focused throughout the rest of his or her life. Evaluative comments. No approach to personality has so profoundly affected the modern view of human nature as Freud's dynamic perspective. His descriptions of unconscious motives and of early childhood development have penetrated every aspect of modern life, from child-rearing practices to film and literature. Even the phrases associated with Freudian theory like unconscious, ego, Oedipus complex, Freudian slip, free association are embedded in the fabric of everyday conversation. However, a close examination of the theory raises a number of perplexing issues and criticisms. First, psychoanalytic concepts are vague and not operationally defined, and the hypotheses derived from them cannot be tested. Thus, much of the theory is difficult to evaluate scientifically. Second, the theory does not reliably predict what will occur. It is applied retrospectively after the events have occurred. Thus, the theory involves historical construction, not scientific construction of probable actions and predictable outcomes. Third, several of Freud's proposals are not consistent with the findings of modern research. For instance, his ideas about the meaning of dreams. Fourth, the theory is based on a small number of clinical case studies which cannot be considered as representative of human beings generally. In addition, the theory never included observations or studies of children, although it is a developmental theory. Fifth, the theory contains so many different concepts that they can explain virtually any behavior in an after-the-effect manner. The vague formulations permit manipulations to fit the evidence at hand. Finally, there is a growing concern among feminists that the Freudian perspective has an androcentric bias, that is, male-centered bias, and views women as vain, sensitive, and dependent on men. However, some aspects of Freud's theory continue to gain acceptance as they are modified and improved through empirical scrutiny. For example, the concepts of unconscious, defense mechanisms, and the importance of anxiety in psychological disorders have been explored and accepted. The theory thus remains the most complex, comprehensive, and compelling view of normal and abnormal personality functioning, even when its predictions haven't been validated by empirical research. Anxiety is produced due to the interactions within the psyche and as a result of external reality. There are three kinds of anxiety resulting from the interaction between the three components of the structure of personality. Realistic anxiety is associated with objective threats to our well-being, and it may involve real danger. Neurotic anxiety occurs when the ego is threatened by the irrational forces of the id. More anxiety results when the superego threatens to overthrow the ego. The ego deals with the anxiety by employing certain unconscious mental operations that deny or distort the reality. These are called ego defense mechanisms and include repression, reaction formation, regression, denial, introjection, sublimation, rationalization, and intellectualization. Personality is determined primarily during the first 5 years of life, and the child's negotiation with his or her impulses at each stage determines the adult personality. We proceed through a series of psychosexual stages: oral, anal, phallic, a latency period, and genital. A different part of body serves as the primary erogenous zone during each stage, providing the main source of pleasure and also conflict. Deprivation or overindulgence in pleasurable activities associated with each erogenous zone may result in fixation of the individual in that particular stage. Among the weaknesses of psychoanalysis are internal inconsistencies, methodological problems, an overemphasis on sex, and an androcentric bias. It has proved difficult to subject the propositions of psychoanalytic theory for empirical research. Nevertheless, Freud's contributions are monumental. The importance of the unconscious, the concept of an ego, free association, dream interpretation, repression and the defense mechanisms, anxiety, and more. The theory thus remains the most complex, comprehensive, and compelling view of normal and abnormal personality functioning.